Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7. It's Tuesday the 26th of April. I'm Hugh Stewart, I'm in the Glasgow studio, and I'm joined tonight by Maureen Watt, who's in Aberdeen. And Maureen is a former MSP for Aberdeen South and Kincardineshire North. You retired in 2021. Okay, Maureen, so how's your sound and vision? Can you hear me and see me okay?
I can hear you and see you fine. I hope you can do the same for me.
That's fine. You look very clear on my screen anyway, so I trust everyone at home can see us both. Right, Maureen, what I'm going to do is run over the latest updates from the Ukraine situation, and then we're going to discuss quite a lot of news tonight. So I'll just go through the latest. Today brings us to day 62 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the UK Armed Forces Minister James Heappey has described Ukrainian strikes on Russian soil, which hit logistics supplies, as completely legitimate. He said the fact that Ukraine was a sovereign country living peacefully within its own borders, and then another country decided to violate those borders. In war, Ukraine needs to strike into its opponent's depth to attack its logistics lines, its fuel supplies, its ammunition depots, and that's part of it. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has travelled to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin in an attempt to put the UN at the heart of Ukrainian mediation efforts. Guterres has faced criticism from Ukraine for not visiting Kyiv first and for failing to intervene decisively before Russia invaded on the 24th of February. He's also met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov before travelling to Ukraine. Officials from more than 40 countries are gathering at Germany's Ramstein airbase today, Tuesday, for US-hosted talks, expected to focus on how to arm Kyiv against a Russian onslaught in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces are likely to be attempting to encircle heavily fortified Ukrainian positions in eastern Ukraine, the UK's Ministry of Defence has said in its latest intelligence update. The city of Kreminna in the Luhansk region has reportedly fallen, it said, and heavy fighting was being reported south of Izium in the province of Kharkiv, as Russian forces attempt to advance towards the city of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the north and the east. Moldovan President Maia Sandu convened a meeting of the country's Supreme Security Council this afternoon following reports of attacks in Transnistria. Shelling was reported on a military unit near the city of Tiraspol, as well as the destruction of two Soviet-era radio antennae in the breakaway region this morning. The Ukrainian Defence Ministry said that attacks in Transnistria were planned provocations by Russia. Denis Pushilin, the leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, said on a Russian talk show broadcast online that the next phase of Russia's military intervention was crucial following security incidents outside the region. He cited the blast that hit Transnistria as well as the Russian allegations of shelling of its border regions by Ukrainian forces. Russia and Belarus will hold joint drills of their air forces and air defence forces in Belarus, Minsk's defence ministry said in a statement. Ukraine's postal service says it plans to issue a new stamp to honour the Antonov 225 Meria, which means dream in Ukrainian, which was the world's largest cargo plane before it was destroyed on an attack on Hostomel Airport near Kyiv shortly after Russia launched its invasion. Okay, before we move on, Maureen, have you any comments to make on the latest stories, day 62 of Russia's attack?
Well, it's absolutely tragic that we're counting up to day 62, but I think today could perhaps mark a bit of a milestone because we have all these meetings going on, both with Guterres going to Moscow, as usual, being kept waiting by Putin to meet him, but also the meeting that you mentioned in Ramstein, where a lot of European leaders and defence ministers have been meeting. It's great to see that more countries are giving more military aid to Ukraine, because it doesn't look as if Putin is going to stop any attacks anytime soon, unless Guterres can get some sort of breakthrough, which at the moment doesn't look particularly likely. Apparently, they're sitting at the great long table, which doesn't fill you with a lot of confidence. But at least it's jaw, as well as the wah. And in the end, it is jaw that has to win through.
Well, on the subject of talks, we will be referring on a couple of items later on to that Ramstein meeting today, which you referred to. Now, first of all, in Germany, the German government is going to authorise the delivery of tanks to Ukraine. German Defence Ministry has said that this would be a clear switch in Berlin's cautious policy on military backing for Kyiv. The German government has agreed to sign off the delivery of Gepard anti-aircraft tanks. Christine Lambrecht told an international meeting of defence ministers, that one you were talking about, Emma, at the Ramstein airbase today. And this was according to the draft of her speech, which was seen by Agence France Presse. As we said, 40 countries are holding American talks at the Ramstein airbase on bolstering the defence capabilities of Ukraine. The US-hosted meeting will focus on doing things to generate additional capacity and capacity for the Ukrainian forces. This is according to US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin. France is delivering Caesar cannon, which have a range of 25 miles, and Britain has provided Starstreak anti-aircraft missiles and tanks. Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor, has also faced criticism from his coalition government, which is a partnership between the SPD, the Greens and the Liberal FPD. The Chancellor has justified his cautious approach by saying that he wished to avoid a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia because, of course, it's a nuclear power. But according to a draft document seen by Agence France Presse on Tuesday today, the three coalition parties in Germany now plan to present a joint proposal in Parliament calling for the delivery of heavy weapons to Ukraine. The document urges the government to continue and, where possible, accelerate the delivery of necessary equipment to Ukraine, including extending the delivery of heavy weapons and complex systems. It also suggests Ukrainian soldiers be trained in Germany and in other NATO countries to operate these new weapons. So Germany has certainly been on the fence, it looks like. I'm sure they would deny that, but there's been what's called a cautious approach. What strikes me, Maureen, is that the Green Party in Germany is now saying send in heavy weapons. Is this an indication of how anyone who's democratic, whether left or right, sees the Russian imperialism as a threat to everybody?
Well, I think it shows, as we've seen here in Scotland, that if you're in government, you have to be much more responsible than some of the more outlandish things you can perhaps say when you're in opposition. I mean, I can understand Germany's situation. I'm long enough to have known about the partition of Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how many Germans do still have a fear of Russia, if you like. So I think I can understand why Germany they have been told so many times not to rearm. So I think this is a very significant moment from Germany, but it's good to see now that they are being recognised as a force for good in this, and that they can make their contribution in terms of defence forces to Ukraine, as well as the many other countries around the world that are sending forces. And I think it's also significant that we're perhaps seeing we could be seeing a different type of warfare in the Donbass and Luhansk region down at the southeast of Ukraine compared to the bombardment of the cities and the failed attempt of Russian forces to take Kyiv. So I think it could be a different type of war, and that's why Ukraine are now asking for and need different types of defence capability.
Yes, but it's ironic that one of the things that Vladimir Putin's invasion has achieved is to rearm Germany. As you say, Emma, really for generations after 1945, Germany focused on peaceful development of industry, and we're told, and in fact we're quite happy to not develop the arms industry, but they're being forced to do that now by Putin's invasion. So one of the ironies of the attack on Ukraine. Now let's go back to the United States. The United States position. The US has vowed to move heaven and earth to help Ukraine win its battle against Russia's invasion as it hosted defence talks today in Germany, the Ramstein talks we referred to earlier, where US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin pledged to help Ukraine win the fight against Russia's unjust invasion and to build up Ukraine's defences for tomorrow's challenges. Mr. Austin opened his remarks saying, "As we see this morning, nations from around the world stand united on our resolve to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia's imperial aggression. Ukraine clearly believes that it can win, and so does everyone here. The US is already the biggest military supplier of aid to Ukraine, and Mr. Austin said Washington will keep moving, as he put it, heaven and earth, so we can meet Kyiv's needs." Mr. Austin described Russia's invasion and atrocities in Ukraine as indefensible, saying, "We all start today from a position of moral clarity. Russia is waging a war of choice to indulge the ambitions of one man," and he added, "Ukraine is fighting a war of necessity to defend its democracy, its sovereignty and its citizens." So the US is saying, well, really just about everyone is united against Ukraine. That's not completely true, is it, though? Because China is, I used the phrase, sitting on a fence unfairly, I think, with Olaf Scholz earlier on. Maybe he's not doing that. But I think that's definitely what China's doing, or sitting on the wall. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen from the European Union was in India yesterday. So again, India has strong trade links and receives a lot of energy from Russia. So not everyone's on board. Do you think there's any possibility that as this war continues and as Russia's clearly not succeeding, do you think there's any chance, can diplomacy break India and China away from supporting Putin?
Well, I think their support was that they abstained in the vote, didn't they, at the UN? How much they are supporting China and India are supporting Russia, I think we're not really all that sure. But good heavens, I can't see India and China taking up arms on Russia's side. But you never know, because the fact that all the West seems to be piling in to help Ukraine now, what effect will that have on Putin? And I heard one commentator today to say that this is Putin's war, and all seems to rest on him, rather than, of course, the people of Russia, who've got no voice in this at all. So, as I said earlier, I think this is kind of a key moment in what's going to happen as we go forward, and very worrying.
Yes, I'm not suggesting that China or India are providing any military or logistics support, but it's mainly about, I guess they're not really taking part in the boycott, are they? Most countries in Europe and the West are now basically refusing to deal with Russia, except, of course, for importing energy. And Germany is still doing that. They have to, of course, because for over the years they built up dependence on Russian gas, so they can't switch that off overnight. But that's what I'm talking about, really. Is it likely that we can persuade those countries to stop trading with Russia? It's easy for us to say that if we're not using Russian gas, but other people depend on it. That's the reality, isn't it?
Yeah, I wonder if that should be our main focus as well, because, as a bit of me says, just let sleeping dogs lie at the moment rather than rile up, especially China. Obviously, the trips to India, both from the UK Prime Minister and Ursula von der Leyen, have been ostensibly in relation to trade deals. But obviously, there have been talks about the situation in Ukraine. So, the Indians are their own masters, and whether we have any influence or not remains to be seen. But I think, as I said originally, that, the fact that other Western countries are piling in to help Ukraine now is very significant.
Okay, so that's the meeting in Ramstein today. Large numbers of countries pledging support, military or logistical, for Ukraine. So let's go back to UK now. Our next story is on the economic crisis. New research has found that people are facing another hit to their pockets with continued higher food bills this year. Analysis by Kantar found that grocery prices were 5.9% higher this month than a year ago. That's the biggest rise since December 2011. and that the average food bill could increase by £271 this year. This follows figures from this month, which highlighted that prices are increasing at their fastest rate in decades, with inflation rising to 7%, and that's a staggering 30-year high. UK shoppers have begun to stockpile some items, essentials such as cooking oil, as grocery price inflation hit its highest level in more than a decade this April. Prime Minister Johnson has responded by ordering his cabinet ministers to come up with what he calls new non-fiscal ways to combat the cost of living, in a tacit acknowledgement that the government's spring statement, failed to match the enormity of the crisis. The UK government has ignored calls from the SNP for an emergency budget to deliver real support to struggling households. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "The Tory government is too engulfed in scandal to get on with the day job of tackling the cost of living crisis, spiralling out of control under its watch. With new research revealing that people face yet another hit, with the average food bill potentially increasing by a staggering £271 this year, families need action, not more hot air from this out-of-touch Tory government." I'd like to add a personal note here. I went for messages today, and some supermarkets are limiting you to 2 bottles of cooking oil. That's because most of it comes from Ukraine and Russia. So that's part of that. But the main thing, I said at the start, this is an economic crisis. Now, the government doesn't call that, but I think if millions of people have been plunged into poverty, well, you know, everything's going up. I'd call that an economic crisis. Do you agree with that way of putting it?
Yes, it is absolutely an economic crisis. And Alison Thewlis is quite right that the government seem to not know what they could do. In the meantime, you have people like the boss of Iceland making sure that he is going to keep his prices as low as possible, and actually extending the range of the food deliveries that he's going to do from his stores to make sure that people in poverty don't have to travel themselves, and that the food will be delivered to their doors. But I think this has shown just what a breadbasket Ukraine has been for the whole of Europe. And I think it is important, and it's obviously not important to the UK government, that we look to make sure that our farmers are given the opportunities and the mechanisms to produce as much food as we can at home, and it gives the opportunity for people to shop locally when they can, and increase the opportunities for people to shop local and buy home produced food where possible. It might be a bit more expensive, but we know that its provenance is excellent. And if it means buying better meat but fewer times a week, that is something that more and more people, I think, are considering, as this crisis inevitably will deepen if the UK government are not prepared to have an emergency budget and show some inclination to help the citizens of the UK. I mean, we saw in France prior to the election, thank goodness Macron has been re-elected, that he put a price cap on energy price rises, for example. There are things this government could be doing, but it chooses so far not to.
Yes, I noticed that phrase, non-fiscal. The government has been asked to find ways of dealing with a food crisis. What does he mean by non-fiscal? That presumably either means he's not going to change the increase in tax, because that is one thing that Rishi Sunak did announce. Let's face it, putting up national insurance is in fact a tax increase. And the other thing, of course, he could do is actually spend government money the Scottish government has various measures that they are taking to help with the crisis. So the UK government is making money, if you like. They are bringing in extra money from VAT because of the price rises. So the Sunak government, the Sunak Treasury could spend money on alleviating the crisis, but that's been ruled out, isn't it? I think that's what you mean by non-fiscal measures.
Yes. My basic class in economics at university was a long time ago. But I think you're right. And, the government could do other things. As you say, they are having lots of money come in, not only from VAT, but fuel taxes, as well as the price of fuel goes up. So it is a choice of government not to do anything. And I am sure that people will see this inactivity from the UK government and make their voices heard through the upcoming council elections next week, because that is about the only way, apart from taking to the streets, and I don't think that can be ruled out over the summer. That's one of the more important ways that people can make their voices heard.
Yes, I'm just looking at an opinion poll today for those elections showing that the Conservatives are not looking good. They're already briefing, aren't they, that they don't think these elections are going to go well. So we will be reporting on the elections, of course, in Glasgow. I don't know about everywhere else. The Mayor of Fifth Council elections are being counted on May the 6th. Is that happening in Aberdeen, do you know?
Yes, it is. For Aberdeen City and Shire, they're counted together, yeah.
Okay,
At
so
the
because
new
it obviously takes
yeah.
quite a long time to count the different rounds of the transferable votes, so they're just
Yeah.
doing the whole thing up early Friday morning. So we'll be commenting on that on Friday lunchtime onwards. So more on that later. So back to UK, as you say, Maureen, it's a deliberate choice of the Chancellor not to use the tax revenue he's pulling in to alleviate poverty. Another deliberate choice, of course, is the deal which the UK negotiated with the European Union. A new report has revealed the depth of the decline in trade caused by leaving the EU. Analysis conducted by the LSE, that's the London School of Economics Centre for Economic Performance, has concluded that the UK's post-Brexit trade deal with the EU has caused a huge decline in the number of relationships the UK has with the bloc, with red tape at the border, curbing the ability to export for smaller firms. The analysis concluded that the trading data between buyers and sellers has declined by 1/3 following the agreement signed by Boris Johnson back in January 2021. That's 1/3 in just a year. That's a fast working policy. The SNP shadow international trade spokesman Drew Hendry, MP, says he believes the only way to protect Scotland's businesses from more Westminster mismanagement is by rejoining the European Union as an independent country. Commenting, the SNP shadow international trade spokesman for that is Drew Hendry. He went on to say, with each passing week, we see new figures that highlight the devastating impact Brexit is having on business across all four nations of the UK. Ever since Boris Johnson signed his botched Brexit agreement, businesses have faced unnecessary red tape, dodgy trade deals, skyrocketing tariffs, and untold misery. This was something Scotland did not vote for, and he said we shouldn't settle for it. I was just talking about the figures earlier on. Since 2021, the amount of business, the amount of importing and exporting has fallen by 1/3. That's really quite drastic, isn't it? That's quite enormous. But it's also not surprising, is it, to me, if you leave a trade agreement, if you leave a single market, you're going to do less business with that single market. So we expected that, didn't we? But 1/3 is pretty impressive figures for Boris Johnson, don't you think?
Yeah, I haven't read the report itself, but I did also hear that apparently the value has stayed the same, but that, as you said, the number of exporters has declined massively. I mean, I remember pre-COVID that it was said that the Northeast and Aberdeen would lose £9,000 per person because of Brexit. And that has absolutely happened. I mean, I know that very few of the fish processors in my former constituency who used to send daily fish lorries to across the channel to the fish market at Boulogne-sur-Mer just don't do it anymore. And I know, for example, from the West Coast and the shellfish sector, it's exceedingly difficult to do it. I'm not sure whether some have managed now to get back in, but it's the small, as you said, it's the smaller people, Hugh, the smaller business people who just haven't got the time or the resource of people to do the paperwork to get small consignments across, because they've all got to be bulked together at depots to make sure that they can be transported across. And it's just not worth their while to do it, which is really sad, because Scotland has got some wonderful produce, not just food and drink, but other produce that people would love to export, but it's just too difficult and time consuming to do so. And independence is the only way that that's going to change, so that we can re-engage with our European neighbours and partners and see the exports of our wonderful quality produce to Europe.
Yes, that produce is actually very popular in Europe. Now, there are two delays. There's one delay, which is the queues at Dover, and the other delay, of course, is that we are not in the single market. We're a third country. So, as you say, Scotland cannot do anything about that unless it votes for independence. Could we do something about beating the Dover delay by going somewhere else? Why does Scotland not have any direct ferry routes? Ireland has increased its number of ferries now, so obviously a place like Aberdeen seems the obvious place to be selling ships to Zeebrugge or Denmark. There
Yeah.
must be a big market for that, surely.
You would think so, and I think that the lack of us having independence is the main reason for that as well. I mean, I remember being on the transport committee on two separate in two separate parliaments, and engaging with the people in Zeebrugge. One to keep the ferry going. To Zeebrugge, but the other one to get it going again more recently. I know that because of the time at sea, the fish producers would rather travel by lorry to take it down to the English Channel. But I think, with climate change and other reasons, the a ferry option, not necessarily for fish, but for other produce, should be an option. And I getting ferries, not our other ferry problem aside, getting ferries is quite difficult at the moment. But I think it is something that in an independent Scotland would be a priority, to get a direct link to the continent from Scotland, and would again help and give impetus to our sales across in Europe.
Okay, so on the subject of ferries, we're going to move on to the next story. This has just come in this afternoon. We've heard that the P&O ferry to Ireland had a catastrophic breakdown today, but it has actually made it into port. So the story is that a P&O passenger ship, the one which operates between Scotland and Northern Ireland, was stranded in the Irish Sea for 2 hours today after a mechanical failure. The European causeway, which sails between Cairnryan and Larne, lost power before eventually arriving at the Northern Ireland port. The ferry, which can carry 410 passengers and 53 crew, left Cairnryan at 12 o'clock today approximately, BST, and was expected to reach Larne by 2 o'clock. However, the Coast Guard was alerted to a mechanical failure on the vessel at approximately 1:30. A tug was sent to the location, and the Royal National Lifeboats Institution confirmed they had sent 3 lifeboats. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, the MCA, said that the European causeway did restore power and was escorted to the port. She docked at Larne shortly before 4 o'clock, 1600 hours today, according to data from the vessel tracking website Marine Traffic. P&O Ferries said the ship had experienced a temporary mechanical issue before continuing on its scheduled journey to the port of Larne. However, the ship was unable to complete its scheduled return journey to Cairnryan. Now, the European Causeway is the ship which was prevented from re-entering service in March following P&O's sacking of the crew. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency said that after inspection, there were failures of crew familiarisation, vessel documentation and crew training. So presumably they've got out of that problem, and we don't know what led to this mechanical failure, but I think maybe P&O was fortunate that it was fairly calm seas today, because that can be a really dangerous crossing, can't it?
Absolutely. I haven't done it in recent times, but it just shows you how P&O have completely shot themselves in the foot with the debacle over replacing the existing crews with cheaper foreign crews. We don't, as you say, know exactly what happened, but the fact that the MCA, Maritime and Coast Guard agencies, took so long to make sure that the vessel was ready to sail was obviously good on their part. And as you said, it's just as well that the weather was quite calm. I understand that the Maidens of Larne are a rocky outcrop. It was quite near there that the vessel lost power. It must have been absolutely terrifying for those on board, because this actually is, I understand, a very rare occurrence. I think the last time was on the short crossing to the Isle of Wight, where a ferry completely lost power. So it is a very unusual occurrence, and as I say, must have been very frightening from those on board. And again, another black mark on P&O.
Yes, so fortunately nobody was injured and the ship was able to steam in under her own power. But it is very unusual, I am informed, that for such a catastrophic failure. And with rocky coastlines nearby, that could have ended up a lot worse. Okay, we're going to move on to a Scottish Government debate today on easing the cost of going to school for low-income families, in a Scottish Government debate led by the Education Minister Shirley Ann Somerville on reducing the cost of a school day for low-income families. The Scottish Government proposed a motion recognising the actions being taken to support children and young people in low-income families to access school education. The Scottish Government said its commitments include expansion of free school meals, provision of free school milk, the removal of core curriculum charges, ensuring low-income families don't face costs for curriculum-related trips, the abolition of fees for instrumental music tuition, increasing a school clothing grant, producing guidance to reduce school uniform costs, the provision of a digital device and connectivity to every pupil. The Scottish Government is also committed to services to support income maximisation and recognises that this complements a wide range of policy initiatives set out in the Scottish Government's child poverty strategy for Scotland to maximise household resources and to improve children's well-being and life chances. There was an amendment by Labour MSP Michael Mara which recognised the need for accessible and wraparound childcare. The amendment was approved, and the motion as amended was then approved by Parliament by 80 votes to 29. Okay, so I wonder what the issues are here. Is it simplifying school uniforms? Is to make them less complicated, make them cheaper to actually buy? And it's also about using digital methods so that, well, children who are on free meals are maybe not singled out. Do you happen to know, Maureen, how does that work? Can one tell who's on free school meals or who isn't? Or is it done in a more intelligent way than it used to be?
I'm sure it's done in a more intelligent way than it used to be, but I think there still can be problems, and obviously there's stigma around that. But, that list, Hugh, that you read out, almost everything there is provided in Scotland and not in England and Wales. And it shows how the Scottish Government, with its limited resources, is trying to help families on low incomes. I think there's always been a debate about whether children should wear school uniforms or not. And, we're seeing uniform clothes banks popping up all over the country so that uniforms can be reused. We know how children grow so quickly and need new clothes all the time. So everything like, breakfast clubs, fresh milk, the recent introduction of free making sure that music tuition is free, and the laptops, digital devices that were given to children, especially during COVID when they were studying at home. All of these things are designed to help those on lower incomes. And, we know that that's not happening in England because we have people like Marcus Rashford lobbying the government all the time on some of these issues.
Yes, Marcus Rashford has been described as the leader of the opposition. Just before we move on, another point here is that the Scottish Government agreed with the amendment by Michael Mara. Now, well, so two parties working together, that's what the Scottish Parliament is supposed to do, isn't it? In your experience, was that quite unusual? Or did the parties usually take an antagonistic position? Was it quite easy to work on issues like this with Labour members?
I think I think, especially on issues of social justice like this, there was always an attempt by the business managers of the parties to make sure that their amendments were framed in such a way that they could be supported by the government. And I think this is very much in line of a kind of wraparound care that the government is trying to do. And I think, Labour would have wanted to support it. I wouldn't have thought that they would have wanted to be on the wrong side on an issue like this.
Okay, so that's some bipartisan policy. So only 29 against that proposal. I bet you can guess who
Well,
they are.
I wonder who that was. Yeah.
Right, so next story now. We're going to return to a story we reported on last week. The SNP describes the UK government's Rwanda policy as disastrous. The SNP has blasted the UK government's Rwanda policy, which of course is the policy of processing asylum seekers not in England but in Rwanda, 4,000 miles away. The SNP has accused the UK government, of glossing over the human rights concerns surrounding the country and the proposals to outsource the process of asylum seekers to the African nation, challenging the Foreign Secretary to name a single NGO who supports the UK government's plan. SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesperson Alan Smith MP claimed this policy would do nothing to prevent people trafficking or the dangerous boat journeys across the Channel. The Stirling MP was joined in raising concerns from senior Foreign Office officials by his SNP colleague Deirdre Brock in the House of Commons chamber. She highlighted the Foreign Office's assessments on the oppression faced by LGBT communities in Rwanda, with many refugees being forced to flee the country. They were joined by Linlithgow and Falkirk East MP Martin Day, who raised reports that adults orphaned during the genocide in Rwanda were being forced out of their accommodation in order to make room for asylum seekers sent from the UK. Alan Smith MP said, "This is a clearly disastrous policy from a government all too keen on continuing to gloss over the human rights records of other nations in pursuit of its own hostile environment-orientated ideological goals." It's very difficult to find anyone who supports this Rwanda idea. So I guess you're going to agree with what Alan Smith says. But what do you know about Rwanda? Is it we read the other day that Boris Johnson said that it's a safe country, but there have been questions raised about the human rights record and freedom of speech in that country. What do you think?
I haven't been to Rwanda, but I met a Rwandan delegation at a meeting in South Africa a good few years ago now. But we did have an argument just at the end of the conference on the floor of the meeting. It didn't quite end up in fisticuffs, but it almost did. And it was about the rights of LGBT people. So to say that Rwanda is a safe country for people, in my view and my experience, it certainly is not. I don't think things have changed so much there now. I do know that Rwanda is good on having equality in the parliament insofar as they have, I think, an equal number of men and women parliamentarians, but in terms of human rights and particularly LGBT rights, they are not in any way, shape or form up to speed on that. So as you said, I mean, no NGOs are supporting this policy. The civil service, as we know, didn't sign off the amount of money that was going to cost. It's quite rare that happens for a department civil servants not to back their cabinet secretaries and ministers. So all in all, I just think I'm sure it is going to fail. And in this case, I absolutely do hope it's going to fail because it's just a disastrous, ill thought out policy. We need people to come to this country. We're short of labour in all sorts of areas. And I think this policy is just a disaster for the whole of the UK.
Yes, this is the hostile environment. That, of course, is the policy termed by Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary. The idea which the Conservatives seem to think, as your SNP colleague Marion Fellows told me, the Conservatives think they've been elected to carry out a hostile environment. So they're continuing with that strategy. Now, we're going to move on now to the Twitter story. People have been hearing, of course, for a few days now that Elon Musk was planning to take over Twitter, and it's going to go ahead. Twitter's co-founder, Jack Dorsey, has backed Elon Musk's controversial bid, which is $44 billion, that's about £34 billion, to take over the microblogging platform, describing the millionaire as the singular solution I trust. The 45-year-old, that is Dorsey, who co-founded the company in 2006 and floated it on the New York Stock Exchange in 2013, said it's been owned by Wall Street and that Musk's deal, struck on Monday to take it private, was the correct first step. However, Dorsey, who steps down as Twitter chief executive, he did step down in November, and will receive a $978 million payout for his 2.4% stake. I'll just read that out again. His payout will be $978 million for 2.4% of the company. That's when the deal is completed this year. Said that ultimately, in principle, I don't believe anyone should own or run Twitter. It wants to be a public good at a protocol level, not a company, he said in a series of tweets. Solving for the problem of it being a company, however, Elon is the singular solution I trust. I trust his mission to extend the light of consciousness. Let's remember that phrase. We'll come back to that in a minute, Maureen. The light of consciousness. Parag Agrawal, who took over from Dorsey as chief executive, has told staff that their jobs are only safe for about 6 months, which is how long it will take to get the deal done. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, raised concerns that hate speech may be allowed to flourish after a change in ownership. Musk, who is the world's richest person, has described himself as a free speech absolutist and has criticised Twitter's moderation policies. Dorsey tweeted that Musk's plan to create a platform that's maximally trusted and broadly inclusive was the right one. Musk has pledged to clean up Twitter bots on the platform, which have been used to attempt to manipulate big events such as political elections. However, Vivian Schiller, the former head of news and journalism partnerships at Twitter, fears that Musk may not realise the challenges of content moderation. Okay, so there's a number of different issues here. If you don't mind, Maureen, I'm going to sidestep the business of Wall Street and whether it's a shareholder-owned multi-stock company or whether it's owned by one singular person. But let's look at this business of moderating and access to media and free speech. Now, Twitter and other platforms are the media now, aren't they? But they're not overlooked at. They're not regarded as media by the old authorities, the sort of people who used to look at newspapers. So where do you stand in the question of free speech or the question of taking hate speech out of the media?
Well, I know you want me to forget about whether it's another company or not, but I can't forget about these eye-watering sums. I mean, we're talking about 34 million, I think you said.
Yeah.
You know, that's only a bit less than Scotland's budget. So it's just eye-watering and to me just rampant capitalism. But I think we've got to put this in perspective. I mean, I don't think, if I recall, Twitter has as many users as, for example, Facebook. And I would say that in my experience, the younger generation who use social media more than the rest of us, perhaps, are quite fickle and can easily move from one social media platform to another. I mean, I think a lot moved from Twitter, for example, to Instagram. But I do think that this is an area that we'll probably come back to and one to watch because we know that media in the hands of one person can be awful, e.g. the Sun and the Mirror, and in its time. So it certainly is one to watch, and it could be very, very worrying. Clearing up bots might be a good idea. It would be a good idea, but the thought that Elon Musk might not use it to try and influence things, why else would you buy up something like a social platform, I think this is very much a wait and see area.
Yes, people have been saying really throughout the history of capitalism that people who've made a lot of money have wanted to, wanted to have a newspaper
Yeah.
or a TV station, excuse me. But as I was saying earlier, now let's go back to that quote from the outgoing chairman. I trust his mission to extend the light of consciousness. So what we're talking about here is, I guess, these guys are saying, a bit like the fellow who set up Wikipedia, like we are the media, we are the ability of anyone who's got a smartphone to find out what's happening. But they're not regulated as the media, are they? They can do what they want, they can make up their own policies. The same goes with Facebook. I think you're right in saying Facebook is bigger. It has something like 4 billion, I think I'm right, which is half of the human race. But they're not regulated. And I remember Stuart Cosgrove saying a while ago that they are the media, but they don't call themselves media, because if they were, they would have to be regulated, they would have to be overseen, and their policies would have to be approved. So what about this business of, do you regard, is that where you go to for news? Because a lot of people do. I do.
Yes, it's one of the sources that I go to, certainly. I mean, you can spend an awful lot of waste, I might say, an awful lot of time on there reading all the different going off onto different channels of it. But it is one of the platforms. But, others are springing up all the time. And as I said earlier, I think this is something that we need to wait and see what happens. But on the whole, I would think it's a bit worrying when something goes into private hands from a regulated company on the stock market.
Yes, of course. I suppose that, well, just go back to that point. Yes, I suppose as a joint stock company, there are multi shareholders, and people then at annual general meetings can raise a point. So what's happening now is it's as you say, it's one man. It's up to Elon. So what exactly should be the policies of Twitter? What sort of hate speech will be allowed in the name of free speech? Well, the point is, it's entirely up to Elon Musk. He owns the whole thing. It's not a company. It's just him. So maybe he should be regulated a bit instead of being allowed to run the media. Right, we better move on. As you say, we will come back to that, because I'm sure there'll be more stories on the media. Now, let's move back to a Scottish Government story. Plans have been announced to automatically pay the Best Start grant, the early learning and the school age payments to parents and carers who already received a Scottish Child Payment when their children become eligible. The change will be introduced later this year, when the Scottish Child Payment is extended to all under 16s, and when it's also increased to £25 per child per week. This builds on extensive work already being done to make applying for the Scottish Government's 5 family payments as straightforward as possible. It includes the ability to apply for all children in a household on one single form. The form can be completed online, by phone or on paper. Parents and carers contributed to the design of the form to make sure that the language was clear and easy to navigate. As set out in the recent Tracking Child Poverty Delivery Plan, Best Start Bright Futures, the introduction of automatic awards will remove the need for eligible families receiving the Scottish Child Payment to reapply when their child becomes eligible for the early learning and school age payments. This will mean less paperwork for tens of thousands of families, and ensure that families automatically receive the support to which they are entitled. On a visit to Fair Scotland in Glasgow, Minister for Social Security Ben McPherson said, "Tackling child poverty is a key mission for the Scottish Government, and automating payments where we already have all the information we need will mean parents and carers automatically getting the financial support they're eligible for paid directly to them." So this, Maureen, is really updating, adding more detail to some of the stories we discussed earlier. So on the one hand, the Scottish Government can make payments available, but on the other hand, they've got to be accessible and easy to reach. So let's hope this works as it's planned anyway. But do you welcome this idea of trying to streamline the system?
Absolutely. And I think this is really important to point out that, the devolution of further benefits from the UK government has happened in increments during the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament so far. And, some people have criticise the time that it's taken to take over the powers. But I would congratulate the Scottish Government on taking its time to get things right. And behind the two tenets behind all the devolution of these new benefits has been treating claimants with dignity and respect. So that we've seen, for example, in relation to disability benefits, that you don't have to be reassessed every year if you've got long-term conditions that are never ever going to get any better, as has happened in the past under the UK government. And this theme is being extended to these new benefits. And yes, it's a good idea because it doesn't tie up civil servants' time, the limited number of civil servants that there are who could be dealing with lots of other things. It doesn't take up the time of civil servants in going over these things, which is really worrying and stressful for parents who've got enough and carers who've got enough to cope with anyway. So I really welcome this move.
Okay, so that's making it easier to apply, and in fact, making some of the benefits to which people are entitled automatic. So applying and reapplying isn't even going to be necessary, right? Okay, so let's move on to our final story tonight in the Scottish Parliament. Now, it's normal, I believe, Maureen, for the Scottish Parliament to begin its sessions with a moment of reflection, and today was an unusual one because South of Scotland MSP for the Scottish National Party, Emma Harper, has initiated the first time for reflection in the Scots language since the Scottish Parliament reconvened in 1999. Miss Harper, who along with her SNP colleague Jackie Dunbar, has been raising the profile of the Scots language in Holyrood, earlier this year securing the permission of the presiding officer to have prominent Scottish writer, broadcaster and language activist Billy Kay address the Scottish Parliament chamber. Scots is spoken by more than 1.5 million people and is one of the three native languages spoken in the country today, the other two being English and the Scots Gaelic. Scots is a collective name for Scottish dialects, which include the Lowlands in the south, the Doric in the northeast, and Shetland and others. In the 2011 Scotland census, more than 1.5 million people said they could speak Scots, and another 267,000 people said they could understand Scots but could not read or write the language. 1.1% of adults said they spoke Scots at home or at home. Miss Harper said these statistics serve to demonstrate the need for the Scots language to be promoted and for people to feel empowered to use Scots in day-to-day life. Billy Kay, known internationally for his works, addressed the MPs, noting that history has produced notable Scots-speaking parliamentarians from different parties. He spoke of the importance of the Parliament promoting Scots and how the use of Scots can help in particular young people to excel in their education and indeed in their career. Commenting, Ms Harper said, "It's fantastic that the presiding officer agreed to my request to have Billy Kay come and address the Scottish Parliament in one of our national languages, Scots. Billy is a well-kent Scots screever, broadcaster and language activist, and his presentation to Parliament demonstrated the vital importance of promoting Scots and of empowering people to use Scots in day-to-day life." It's unusual, isn't it, Maureen, to even have language as a controversial issue, is it? Why is it necessary to have a language activist?
Oh, you can have just fair tricket about what happened the day in the Parliament. I was the first MSP to ever take my the oath in Doric, and I remember my colleague, the late Brian Adams, saying, "Oh, damn it, why didn't I think of that?" And, to a certain extent, I'm thinking, oh, why on earth did I not put forward Billy Kay or someone else from the Northeast to do time for reflection in the Doric? But it's great to see that one of Brian Adams' successors, Jackie Dunbar in that constituency, with whom I would speak Doric at the time when we meet up, is involved in this. And Emma Harper is a great proponent of Scots language. She speaks it in the Parliament on any occasion that she can. And I had the privilege as Minister for Schools and Skills, making sure that our Scots languages were embedded in the curriculum for excellence. And I've seen marvellous work in our schools in promoting our other languages besides English in our schools. And we must remember, Hugh, that internationally, very few countries are monoglots, and most countries have a variety of languages spoken within their borders, and Scotland is the norm, not the exception.
Now, the interesting thing is that you don't really hear Scots in the day-to-day debates in the Parliament. I don't think you do anyway. People usually talk, as I do, English. And the reason for that, of course, is we're told, aren't we, at school, that English is proper and Scots are something wrong with it, right? So why don't more people in the Parliament use ordinary Scots words, the sort of words you would use in your time off, or the sort of words that are used maybe in the more working class communities? There's nothing wrong with talking in Scots. Why do more of your colleagues no talk they were brought up to talk?
Well, I think you'll find quite a few of them do bring in Scots words now and again, and some more than others. And you can fall foul with the official report if you don't let them know that you're going to have vast tracts of your speeches in languages other than English. Sometimes if it's Gaelic, for example, and Alistair Allen at least a couple of times in the year introduce a debate in Gaelic, and we have translators. So it's not always easy, but I think there are members from various parties. I mean, I remember Peter Chapman from the Conservatives from the Northeast. Could break into song into sometimes in Doric, and he wrote poetry in Doric. So it's not that unusual, but there is a need to mainstream it more, if you like. I think, Hugh, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Aye, so there's nothing wrong with talking in Scottish. Tell you what, I'll make a commitment. I'll make sure I get some more Scots words in when I'm doing the news, right? So that's
Aye,
just
that's
about.
fine.
Aye, I'll do
No.
that. We'll make that a guarantee, right? So I said it. I better do it now. Okay, so that was the final story for tonight. We had to leave a couple of out. There's quite a lot of news. So thank you for sticking with us. I had to belt through them quite quickly, Maureen. So it's been grand to have you on the programme tonight and to hear your opinions and your experiences. So thank you for joining us. And I hope we can see you again
Thanks
on the
very much.
programme.
All the best.
So I'll just sign off by reminding everybody that we don't get any money from Wall Street. I haven't heard from Elon Musk. I don't think he's planning to buy the station. If he is, it's 2 million is the asking price. But meanwhile, we're going to have to keep on going with your subscriptions. So if you look on the screen just now, that's our website. And if you want to keep broadcasting going in Scotland, remember, we're independent, right? We're not mediated through London. This is broadcasting from Scotland, just from our own point of view. And if you think that's important, I'm afraid you need to pay for it. So if you look at the website, it'd be great if you could join in. I know some of you are paying already. We do have big bills and we do need a hand, right? So thanks for being... if you are one of our supporters, it's really good to have you on board. Now, if you've just joined us, you're very welcome to watch anyway, but we won't be able to keep going unless we get more support from our viewers. So that's it from me tonight, and from Maureen Watts up in Aberdeen. We'll be back for Scotland at 7 tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.